Welcome, everybody. This is the Liberty Classroom History of Economic Thought 1 class. This is the second lecture on pre-classical thought. So here's the outline of what we're going to be covering in this lecture. Hope you guys are eager to jump in. So we're going to cover, as I say, pre-classical economic thought. Now let me apologize, if you will. There is just a tremendous amount on this subject. Literally, we could teach a whole course just on this stuff, all right? But I've just decided in terms of the trade-off between if I get too precise and too much detail on these earlier topics, that leaves less space at the end for things where I think I have the comparative advantage, all right? So I'm not going to apologize anymore for it, but I am going to say I'm going to hit in this lecture the things from pre-classical economic thought that I think you absolutely need to know in order to understand the progression of economic theory over the centuries. All right, so that's what has been guiding me as I've decided from a huge grab bag of things we could have talked about, what things am I going to focus on in this particular lecture. But obviously, if you want to know more, I really encourage you to go and follow things that interest you. That's part of what I'm doing here. Let me just make sure you understand that. I want to give you guys a sampling, a buffet, if you will, of various thinkers from the past so that hopefully some of you are intrigued and want to pursue it further and go read the people in the original and at greater length than we could possibly cover in a course like this. So let me make sure I'm not losing anybody. What do I mean by classical economic thought? Again, when it comes to economics, what we mean by the classical economists are people like David Hume, Adam Smith, David Ricardo. It actually would be a little bit more precise to call that British classical thought, to really be precise, to distinguish it from some of the other strains. All right, so that's what I mean when I say that. And so then what's the modern period that's after the classical period? That begins in the early 1870s with the so-called marginal revolution. All right, so those are the big boundary marks in terms of economic thought as we're going to cover it in this course, and that's standard. Those milestones are standard. That's not something idiosyncratic to me, but I just want to make sure you understand. So when we say pre-classical thought, this is just a grab bag of major trends to explain what were people thinking as we move into the mercantilist era and then see how the British classical economists refuted the mercantilists. Okay, so one obvious subject is the ancient Greeks, and we're going to also then contrast it with the scholastics of the Middle Ages. And so all I'm going to do for a lecture of this level of specificity is focus on Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas, just to give you an idea of the flavor of, obviously, the epitome of those two traditions. All right, so when it comes to Aristotle, Rothbard argues that it's no coincidence that the ancient Greeks were the ones that we credit with inventing philosophy as we know it, and they're also the ones that historians of economic thought credit as inventing economic theory as we know it. So let's be sure we're not confused here. It's not as if human civilization started with the Greeks, right? It's not like Aristotle was the fifth guy ever born. But for whatever reason, and certainly historians can speculate as to why this is, even though other civilizations, cultures existed that had, commerce and so on, booming centers of trade, nonetheless, for whatever reason, people who were, very intelligent and educated and sort of in a position of wealth so they could sit back and observe, they did not start pontificating on those patterns and try to come up with a way of thinking about those market transactions that were occurring day in and day out, whereas the Greeks did. So again, what is it the philosophers do? They kind of sit back and think about things, right? So they try to abstract away from the mundane details of everyday life and try to see patterns or principles, to see the framework of what's going on, something that you could take the particulars of any given day and plug it into this broader, more timeless framework. Right, so if you understand that that's in a very crude sense one way of thinking about what it is that philosophers do, then you realize, oh, that's actually what economists do. Right? Economists don't simply record the price of copper on a given day. No, they try to come up with a framework for understanding the price of copper? What forces are at play? What does it mean to say the price of copper is such and such? So again, Rothbard's saying it's not a coincidence that when we look in the history of economic thought, we start with the ancient Greeks. So here's a quote from Aristotle, here's a quote from Rothbard talking about Aristotle. By analyzing the logical implications of the employment of means to the pursuit of ends in all human action, Aristotle brilliantly began to lay the groundwork for the Austrian theory of imputation and marginal productivity. Okay, so again, that's Rothbard giving kudos to Aristotle and saying that in context here, what Rothbard is saying is that a lot of modern critics of Aristotle dismiss this portion of his analysis as saying, oh, that's just philosophy. That's not really economic theory. And Rothbard's saying, on the contrary, of the stuff that Aristotle wrote that could be remotely relevant to economics, I, Murray Rothbard, as an Austrian who is a fan of what's called praxeology, the Misesian approach to economics and understanding what's the proper scope of economics and what things fall under that field, Rothbard's saying, actually, when Aristotle talks about the relationship of means to ends and how the purpose you have for something, sort of changes how you classify it, right? That it's a what's called a teleological framework. And so that idea of means ends, which Aristotle uses, is a pretty general item in his worldview, not just talking about household management. Rothbard's saying, well, yeah, we need that. We need that kind of toolbox in order to talk about narrowly economic activities, right? But so just in case you're not familiar with this, Ludwig von Mises famously placed economic theory inside a broader study of the logic of human action. And so Rothbard is saying that that's one way of understanding what Aristotle was doing. Obviously, he wasn't very specific about it as Mises was, but he was doing it thousands of years before, so give him a break. So anyway, that's what I'm saying here is Rothbard has a very contrarian take that this is an area where many other historians of economic thought in the mainstream might poo-poo this and say, oh yeah, there's Aristotle being philosophical and not being a good economist, whereas Rothbard's saying, actually, this shows that he's anticipating the later Austrian movements. Just a note on nomenclature here, terminology. So Austrian theory of imputation, what that means is what are the principles that govern when value flows from the finished consumer good up through the factors of production that are used to produce it. Okay, so this is going to be the development of the marginal subjectivist revolution that Karl Menger and then two others ushered in the early 1870s. And marginal productivity, similarly, is saying, how do you evaluate tractors or farmland? Again, you use the marginal analysis. You're not saying what are all the tractors in the world worth. Instead, you're saying, if I had one more tractor in this operation, how much would that boost my revenue? And then that's the value marginal product of the tractor. So what Rothbard is saying is that framework, from an Austrian perspective, relies on the same means-ends distinction and understanding that Aristotle was the first to really develop. And so for that, we need to thank him. Okay, the Greek word, and I'm going to butcher this, oikonomia, can be translated as household management. All right, so Aristotle, in his mind, when he was developing the things that he would refer to as economics, he thought he was giving a theory of how it is that households are managed, right? Because households are like little economies, if you will. And you can see that yourself just in your own daily life, that you have a budget for your household. If you're by yourself, it's just your own budget, or if you're running a family. And it's, in many respects, very similar to a business's financial plan, right? That you have income and you have expenses and so on, and you got to watch that and engage in economical oversight. Okay, so now this quote is from Aristotle. The economical and political signs differ not only in the same degree as a house and a city, for these constitute the subject matter of them both, but also in that political rule involves a plurality of governors, while economic rule is monarchical. Okay, so again, that's Aristotle explaining to the reader the distinction in his mind between economics and politics. All right, and so you can see that the way he was looking at it, it was really just a matter of jurisdiction, right? That the political rulers of a city, for one thing, there's usually a bunch of them, whereas when it comes to the ruler of an individual household, well, that's just a monarch. Okay, so I like this quote because I think it shows you the way Aristotle's viewing things, and we really, again, we're allowed to impose our own value judgments on them. I mean, we're allowed to look at the way someone in the past thought and say, I think that's wrong, or ooh, I think that's a very cumbersome framework, and let's not use that framework anymore. Let's look for something different. That's obviously fine. We don't need to just blindly accept the past and not pass judgment per se. But what I think we do need to do is make sure we're understanding how these past thinkers were viewing things. And so it would be wrong, I think, if we didn't understand the sense in which Aristotle is thinking that economics and political science are related, at least in one sense, as a house is to a city. Okay, the view of merchants that we can find in Aristotle is, again, very typical, and that is carried forward arguably until the Protestant era. And so let me just read a little bit of Aristotle's writings on this, and you get an idea of his viewpoint. So he says, there are four kinds of economy: the regal, the satrapical, the political, and the domestic. All right, so these are different kinds of economy. And he goes on to say, so then he starts talking about them in order, and so now I'm skipping ahead to the third one, the political. Thirdly, let us consider the political economy, and of this, the best is the income which arises from the peculiar productions of the soil. Next, that which comes from traffic and carriage of goods, and then that which is derived from matters of everyday life. Fourth and last comes the domestic economy, and under this kind of economy, the least is an income derived from land, secondly, from matters of daily life, and thirdly, from money. All right, so again, I want you to see the framework that Aristotle is using in his classification scheme. And so you can see here that what he's calling political economy is arguably what we think of nowadays as regular economics, right? That the study of markets and how merchants go out and operate, or various occupations and what they do when they produce and sell for money to the rest of the population, whereas domestic economy is more household management in Aristotle's view, all right? So again, don't be confused there. Political economy in this translation of Aristotle is not what we nowadays mean by political economy. But we can also see in this, from the early part of that quotation that I just read to you, that there is this presumption in favor of agriculture, right? It seemed natural that the land produces something, and then you go ahead and sell that to the rest of the world. You're genuinely adding value, or at least the land is, and you're the human person in charge of that operation, the one benefiting from it. And so it seemed like that was very natural, okay? Whereas it starts to get a little bit fishy when, wait a minute, what's your job? You just move stuff around? It seems like if you're just a pure middleman, a merchant who just buys wholesale from somebody else, doesn't actually physically transform the good and just transports it somewhere, it seems like, that's, yeah, okay, you can earn a living from that. I suppose that's necessary, but that's not nearly as noble or as admirable as somebody who earns an income from selling the fruits of the soil. Okay, and then later on in a few minutes in this lecture, we'll get to the most objectionable or the least noble way of earning income, and that's from lending money out at interest. All right, so obviously it should go without saying I'm not endorsing these common views. I don't want to call them prejudice because that itself would be a prejudicial statement on my part, but I just want to make you aware that this notion that the land is bountiful and natural and productive of value in a way that's very healthy, whereas moving goods around and then charging interest are viewed with suspicion and hostility. That goes back at least to the ancient Greeks. Okay, what about Aristotle's theory of exchange? Well, he said that just transactions required, quote, proportional reciprocity. And he has this famous, or one might say infamous, line where he says, the number of shoes exchanged for a house must therefore correspond to the ratio of builder to shoemaker. And so various people have pontificated on that, and Rothbard just, he's a straight shooter, and he just has the courage to say that doesn't make any sense at all. Like, let's stop trying to figure out what did Aristotle mean by that. It's nonsense. It's gibberish. It doesn't mean anything. All right? So Rothbard's not afraid to say that when it warrants that reaction. So let me just comment on this. Let me paraphrase what Aristotle was saying, that there must be so if we're going to have a just exchange, so somebody exchanges 10 apples for 5 oranges, then there has to be some equality involved there, or else one party's ripping off the other party. Right? I think that's a fair way of paraphrasing Aristotle's view on this. And so then that, in my view, and certainly in the view of modern Austrian economists, just set economics off on the wrong path. Right? That was a major, major mistake, a misstep by the great philosopher when he was essentially founding economic theory, when he started writing these things. And so specifically the mistake is that if you're assuming that that the starting point from a market exchange is to say, okay, if this thing over here on the left exchanges for this thing over here on the right, again, maybe 10 apples for 5 oranges, that you're saying there must be something equal between those two bundles of goods, right? There must be something that is true in quantity of the 10 apples that is also true in quantity of the 5 oranges, and that's why they exchange at par if we want to maintain that both parties are not harmed by the transaction. Okay, so maybe I should be clear. Aristotle wasn't saying that in every transaction that would be met. He was just saying if you wanted to have a just transaction, or if you wanted to feel good about yourself after you've dealt in the marketplace, those conditions had better be met. And so what I'm saying here in this third arrow is that is just, it's understandable. Again, if you're the first person who ever really thought about this stuff, it's understandable that you would say that, but actually, I think, as we'll see once we get to the marginal revolution, I'll come back to this and really hit the point again. But you're just getting off on the wrong foot there. You're not going to be able to solve the problem. And so, just to give you a hint of where we're going to go with this, the modern theory of value, again, by which I mean the theory that came out of the revolution in the early 1870s, says that actually the starting point of analysis, when there's an exchange, if one person sells 10 apples in order to buy 5 oranges, why would they do that? Well, the person giving up the apples for the oranges, that person values 5 oranges more than 10 apples. And conversely, the other person on the other side of the trade values the 10 apples more than the 5 oranges. So you see there's a difference in valuation there. And that explains why they would trade, right? Because if we followed Aristotle and said there's proportional reciprocity, it kind of makes you wonder, what's the point of trading? If you're getting something of equal value in some sense, why don't you just keep the thing you started out with? And so that's the way to get out of that logjam, is to say, actually, there's unequal valuations. And that might seem impossible. You might think, well, wait a minute. How can it be that both parties walk away with the better end of the deal? It's because preferences are subjective, right? That if a boy trades his bologna sandwich for a peanut butter sandwich with a girl at school, both of them can walk away thinking, oh, that's great. I got the better sandwich than what my mom gave me this morning. And there's no paradox there. Whereas if value is something objective that's intrinsic to the objects, then what I just said would be impossible, right? That it can't be that the boy and the girl trade their sandwiches and both walk away with the sandwich that has more calories, because calories are an objective feature of food items. Whereas value, in this context, subjective value, is subjective, all right? And so that's the starting point of analyzing market prices once we get to the 1870s. But back here at the time of Aristotle, he unfortunately set people off on the wrong foot by thinking there must be something equal between them, and that kind of sheds light on his cryptic sentence there about the number of shoes exchanged for a house must therefore correspond to the ratio of builder to shoemaker. And we're going to see, I mean, let's not pick on Aristotle here, this mistake is going to go all the way up through the great classical thinkers. Okay, what about Aristotle on usury? Okay, so first of all, let me give you a warning. Nowadays, like, there could be laws against usury, even in Western economies, and that gives rise to loan sharks, right? It gives scope for the mafia to lend people money at really high rates of interest, and just knowing that you're going to get your kneecaps broken if you don't pay them back. But that's not what these classical thinkers, sorry, I'm meaning like the Greek antiquity, classical Greeks, that's what I mean there. I don't mean Adam Smith. That's what these ancient thinkers mean by the term usury. They mean any lending, or sorry, any earning of money interest on a loan of money whatsoever. Okay, so again, let me say that. In modern times, sometimes people by that term usury mean excessive interest. But back originally, the way that Aristotle talked about it, and then we'll see even Aquinas, to them, interest and usury were what we mean today by interest was what they meant by usury, put it that way. Okay, now it's true there are going to be relaxations and distinctions made later on, and we'll talk about that at the tail end of this current lecture, but I just want to say, if you want to be able to retain all the great stuff in Aristotle and from Aquinas and the other scholastic thinkers, and it's really awkward for you if you're a libertarian that they were so against charging usury, you're going to be tempted to say, well, what they meant was really excessive, and no, that's not being faithful to what they wrote. They actually meant interest per se. Okay, so Aristotle on usury continued. So here's Aristotle talking. For money was intended originally to be used in exchange, but not to increase in interest. And this term usury, which means the birth of money from money, is applied to the breeding of money because the offspring resembles the parent. Wherefore, of all modes of making money, this is the most unnatural. All right, so I just wanted you to read that in the original so you can see where does Aristotle come off objecting to interest. So notice, and this is really what I want to stress here, it is not the issue, the concern by Aristotle, and then we'll see from Aquinas, was not, oh, wow, if somebody's really hard up and has to borrow money, we shouldn't charge them a lot of money, in interest. That's just not fair. That's not the motivation. The motivation is they feel that this type of income is unnatural in some respect, and that's why it's, that they have a prejudice against it. Let me just throw this out there, and we'll see it more clearly when it comes to Aquinas' objection to usury. But if you want to at least understand the mindset, where this isn't just that, oh, they're against commerce or something, but they think there's something really odd about this type of activity that's happening in the marketplace, just make an analogy to modern Austro-libertarian critiques of fractional reserve banking. Okay, so don't misunderstand me, folks. I'm not saying the two go hand in hand. You could quite consistently reject Aristotle and Aquinas' condemnation of usury and still embrace the condemnation of fractional reserve banking by thinkers such as Rothbard and Walter Block and Hans Hoppe and so on. That's perfectly consistent. What I'm saying, though, is if you're trying to really be fair and understand how could these smart guys have come down against the payment of and the charging of interest per se, when it's so ubiquitous in the marketplace, and why didn't they wonder why it happened? And that well, again, Just notice that's very similar to the people who can't understand how somebody like Murray Rothbard could be against fractional reserve banking when it's ubiquitous. What, doesn't he understand why it happens? So that's what I'm saying. That if you just want to understand the logic of it and to see how these people who are so adept in other areas of analyzing the economy could come up with a view that you think is odd, just keep in mind there are plenty of libertarians who think fractional reserve banking is fine so long as it's not fostered by the state, and they can't understand why somebody like Murray Rothbard is against it. Okay, let's move on to the scholastics. Thomas Aquinas, of course, being the epitome of this tradition. So Rothbard on the scholastic school, again, just the constraints we have in terms of time here, I can't do it justice, but this is a great topic. If some of you are budding economists and you're interested in history, or historians for that matter, I think there could be plenty more work done in this area. But one point that Rothbard makes is that the scholastic school, who are often scorned by modern scientific thinkers, because they think, and that's medieval thought, right? That's like a pejorative term. But Rothbard, as you might not be surprised to hear, is actually very fond of this school. And among their other contributions, they inherited and kept alive and nurtured both the natural law tradition and just the idea of using deductive reasoning in order to arrive at truths. That's something that obviously was born systematically under the Greeks, and the scholastics, who famously rediscovered that tradition and then revered it and took a lot from it. It's no surprise that they also took those elements as well. Okay, now here, I'm just relaying this because I found it interesting when I was reading Rothbard's take on this period and these thinkers. I'm not sure if I myself even think this is correct, but I'll just go ahead and relay it to you guys. He says that, look, it's not a coincidence when we sit back and look at which traditions went in certain directions, that the British classical economists, many of whom were Protestants religiously, it's not a coincidence, Rothbard thinks, that they ended up embracing a labor theory of value. Because, again, the Protestant work ethic and valuing work for its own sake. Whereas we're going to see not only the scholastics but other thinkers, French thinkers. So we have Spain and France here being the areas that are going to have economists who pave the way for a subjective understanding of value. And they don't value work per se. They understand that laboring by itself without a goal of consumption is pointless. Okay, so those are, it's going to be undeniable, completely objective as to which economists embrace what type of theory when they're trying to understand market prices. But Rothbard is noting that there seems to be this pattern that Protestants tended to go for a labor theory of value, whereas the Catholic thinkers went towards more of what we would think of as a modern, correct, subjective value theory. So I'm not saying that, obviously, depending on your religious views one way or the other, but it is interesting to just keep that in mind. And Rothbard thinks that as historians of economic thought, we shouldn't ignore that kind of stuff. Obviously, we got to analyze the people's economics thought on its own terms, but to understand the individuals who are promulgating these various perspectives, surely you want to know something about them, right? If somebody grew up the son of a merchant and saw all kinds of transactions day in and day out, that might help you understand why that person wrote on certain topics. So similarly here. Okay, and again, I can't do it justice, but the School of Salamanca, which was founded by Francisco de Vitoria, I'm sure I'm butchering his name, 1485 to 1546, that is acknowledged by Rothbard and others as a precursor to the modern Austrian school. All right, so let me just make sure, in case you've never heard this before, whereas we're going to see Rothbard does not like people calling Adam Smith the father of economics. He thinks, for one thing, that Smith innovated in very many detrimental ways, and that he says if you're going to go back earlier, there's plenty of earlier thinkers before Smith who are much more sound on several key topics. So we'll see those things as we continue. Okay, what about the scholastics and the just price? So, for one thing, let me just be clear, do not believe the caricature of the critics. You will hear some modern economists, if they even know about the scholastics at all, they might say something like, and I'm engaging a little bit in exaggeration here, but I just want you to understand the point. They will say, oh yeah, those medieval scholastic thinkers, they weren't interested in objective empirical analysis or positive analysis. Instead, it was very normative. They just wanted to impose their religious views on the world rather than studying the markets as they were, as they actually were out there existing. So they weren't really scientists. They were more moralists, right? So you might hear people dismissing the writings of the scholastics along those lines. Okay, but that's really a caricature. So there were a few revisionist historians of economic thought, notably de Roover, and what they did is they went through and they said, that's really not faithful to the actual writings of these thinkers from the scholastic period. And again, this is me talking, Murphy. This is why I think it's important, if you really want to know the history of economic thought, you need to read the source material. And that's why, again, as we continue in this course, I'm going to make things available just so you can at least get a sampling of it, because you really don't want to rely exclusively on what other people are saying these ancient thinkers thought, because what if they're wrong? And so that's why it's important to read them in the original. So what de Roover and other revisionists said is, actually, it's not so much that Aquinas and other scholastics thought that for a price to be just, there has to be all these different points, sort of like analogous to just war theory. Rather, all they meant was the market price. And so Lionel Robbins gives a good example to illustrate this distinction. Robbins says in his lecture on this topic, he says, I'm paraphrasing, but he's, look, if one of you came up to me and you had an original Cantillon book or essay, and I recognized what it was, and you were going to sell it to me for £5, I would be a cad if I took you up on that offer, because I would think you probably don't realize the value of what you're selling to me. And so I really shouldn't have taken advantage of you like that, of your ignorance and my superior knowledge. I should have let you know, hey, this is actually a pretty rare thing. Are you sure? I can give you more for it, or just to give you an idea of what it was you were selling. But Robbins says, however, in a different situation, if I go to a used bookstore and I see that out, on the table for £5, then I'm going to snatch that up, because I'm saying the bookseller is in the business of this, and he or she should know how valuable this thing is. And if he or she doesn't know, well, that's tough. I'm not using it in deception or anything. I'm just go ahead and buy that. So Robbins is saying that what Aquinas means in his writings is that if you, in an isolated exchange, are dealing with someone who doesn't know what the market price is or what the going price is, you shouldn't take advantage of that person's ignorance. That would be sinful. All right, but it doesn't mean that the just price in some situations would deviate from what the market price is. Okay, Aquinas even goes so far as to say that a merchant who has news of a future boost to supply may keep this information to himself without sinning, though it would be more virtuous to disclose that information, right? So let's say there's a war going on, there's a blockade of your country, and so some merchant, he gets news that the war is actually over. But this is way back in the day when there wasn't fast communication, and so the merchant shows up into this town, this besieged town that needs foodstuffs, and the merchant is going to sell them at a high price, knowing full well that once the news hits that the blockade has been lifted, the price of these things is going to collapse, because they know, oh, now food's going to be flowing in here like crazy. So Aquinas is saying it would be best of all, you'd be a really good person, acting saintly, if you were to go ahead and tell everyone the good news and let prices adjust, and then you wouldn't be able to unload your cargo at the previously advantageous price. But nonetheless, he's saying, as long as you're not lying about it, if you just go and people say, hey, I'll give you this much for that foodstuffs you're carrying, that's perfectly fine for you to do that. It doesn't make you, you're not sinning. Okay, what about Aquinas on usury? So here he's talking. To take usury for a loan of money is unjust in itself, because to do so is to sell something which does not exist. To make this clear, it must be noted that there are certain things the use of which consists in their consumption. For example, we consume wine when we use it for drink, and we consume wheat when we use it for food. In things of this kind, then, the use of the thing must not be counted as something separate from the thing itself. And then he goes on. If, therefore, someone wanted to sell wine separately from the use of the wine, he would be selling the same thing twice, or he would be selling something which does not exist. Hence, clearly, he would commit a sin of injustice. Similarly, he commits an injustice who lends wine or wheat and asks to be paid twice. That is, once by the return of an equal amount of the thing, and again by charging a price for its use, which is called usury. All right, so you can kind of see the derivation of that term. It's like you're charging someone for the use of the money. And so you can see Aquinas' reasoning here. He thinks that when you lend money to somebody, if you were to charge interest, you would be charging them for the same thing twice. All right, now we're going to see later, especially when we talk about Böhm-Bawerk, we're going to talk about the use theory of interest. And so, don't misunderstand me. I think Aquinas is wrong here. But my point is, you can see where he's coming from, I hope. Again, this is very analogous to some of the modern Austro-libertarian critiques of fractional reserve banking, which say literally, according to some of those writers, that's taking the same deposit and lending it out to two different people, and you can't do that. So you can see here how similar Aquinas' reasoning on usury is. All right, so that's where Aquinas' views come from. That's what motivates that type of thinking. Okay, loopholes on this practice. So over time, loopholes crept into the canon law. So various things. I mean, because look, you could see in the real world, lenders and borrowers keep wanting to engage in voluntary transactions, right? So it's a little awkward if the theologians and church fathers and so on, if they are thinking that this is something that's unjust. And so over time, there's various nuances and distinctions that come into play. So I'm just to give you an idea of what I mean. So for example, yes, usury, you can't just charge someone per se for borrowing money, but what if you're lending money and you're concerned about the repayment? Isn't it okay for you then to charge a premium for the risk that you incur, so that in a sense you're just making yourself whole? Or what if there's this other investment opportunity, right? So you're still allowed to earn an investment return, out in the marketplace. You can buy factors of production, use them to make physical things, and then sell those physical things in the future for more total money than you originally put in. So you earn a return on your money. And so the idea is, well, gee, if I could earn, I'm making these numbers up, of course, if I could earn 5% in this opportunity over here, like, I don't know, just buying some cargo that's intended for to be exported elsewhere, and I think I could earn 5% pretty surely on that operation, and then someone over here wants to borrow money from me for a year, well, can I at least charge enough to make up for the lost opportunity, right? So there's that kind of issue where it seems like, gee, you're not really charging for the use of the interest per se, or the use of the money per se. It almost looks like you're just breaking even relative to what you could have done with it. All right, another one that was really interesting is, what if, let's talk about people who we'll call bankers. What if they just let it be known that, hey, if you have money to deposit and you give it to us, we'll just give you gifts over time. Right? It's not contractual. It's not that we owe it to you. It's not that you're charging us interest per se, right? You can't do that. That would be sinful. But if you put your money on deposit with us and we don't owe you any interest because you're a good guy and you're not going to charge us interest, what if we just, over time tend to give you gifts? And you would know that those gifts, if they stopped coming, you would probably put your money elsewhere with someone who decided to give you gifts once you made that switch. All right, so that would be, or another good one. What if, there's not interest per se, but, hey, I need this money back in 6 months' time, so I'm going to go ahead and give you these 100 gold coins for 6 months, and then you're just going to give me the 100 gold coins back because I'm a good guy. I don't charge interest. I wouldn't do that. That'd be sinful. But you know what? I really want this back within 6 months. If you're a month late, then I'm going to charge you a 10% penalty. And then we kind of do a nod and a wink, and I know you're going to be late, and that's how I'm going to be able to earn interest, right? So if this seems odd to you, just let me make sure you get what's going on here. Both sides of the transaction want to be able to pay interest, right? Because the borrowers know they're going to be able to borrow more money if the lender is earning interest on it. And so that's the issue here. And so by having these theological condemnations of it, it was awkward. The people out in the marketplace wanted to figure out ways to get around it. And so, again, as the canon law on this topic evolved over time, some of these issues came up, and it was no longer as clear as just the charging. It was always the charging of interest per se was wrong in this tradition, but the issue was, what about these other things? Would that be classified as such, or could that be considered as, even though we, from our vantage point, a lot of these things would say in terms of economic theory, oh, that's the same thing, that's equivalent to paying interest. Nonetheless, it might make a difference as to, how does it square up vis-a-vis the church's teachings. Okay, so that's what we will stop with for this lecture, and I'm glad you are sticking with me, and I trust that you're going to be learning more and more economics as these lectures unfold, so stay tuned, everyone, for next time. See you then.